They kicked me out in the middle of the night. My husband stood silently by his mother's side as she screamed that I was ungrateful, that the house would never be mine, that I had to pack my things and leave. The irony was brutal. Every single payment, every installment, every upgrade to that house had come from my hard work. My salary had covered the mortgage, while his was swallowed by family obligations and vague debts that never seemed to end. I had chosen the tiles for the kitchen, the paint for the living room, even the chandelier his mother loved to show off when guests visited. And yet that night, they acted like I was an intruder, like the place I had built was nothing more than their birthright. My hands were shaking as I stuffed clothes into one suitcase, the one I had bought years ago on clearance, back when I still thought building a life together meant sacrifice. I looked at him, my husband, the man I thought was my partner, and he wouldn't even meet my eyes. He just let his mother bark orders, like I was a maid who had overstayed her welcome. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, suitcase dragging behind me, her voice still echoing in the hallway. He didn't follow. He didn't even flinch when the door slammed shut between us. And in that silence, standing on the porch of the house I had paid for, something inside me shifted. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just walked away, knowing they believed they had won. But a few days later, when the papers arrived and the truth of whose name was on the deed finally surfaced, their triumph turned into panic. And for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of calm because they had no idea what was coming next. The next morning, I woke up on my friend's couch with the same clothes from the night before and mascara smudged on my pillow. My phone was full of unread messages, none from him, of course, just group chats and work emails. He hadn't even checked if I was safe. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I had been nothing more than a placeholder in that house, someone to keep the bills paid while he and his mother played royalty. Still, I didn't cry. I opened my laptop and pulled up the mortgage records I had saved years ago. Every statement, every receipt, every transfer, it was all under my name. His name wasn't on a single page. He had insisted back then that it was easier if I handled the financial side, and I had trusted him, thinking it meant partnership. Instead, it became my lifeline. I spent that day calling my lawyer, arranging meetings, gathering documents. Meanwhile, they were posting photos on social media, his mother smiling in my kitchen, him sitting smugly in my chair at the dining table. They acted like they had finally rid themselves of me, but they were sitting in a house that legally wasn't theirs. When my lawyer confirmed that the deed was solely mine, I felt the first wave of relief I'd had in months. The power dynamic had shifted, even if they didn't realize it yet. A few days later, while they were still celebrating my absence, the official notice was delivered to their doorstep. My husband finally called me, his voice shaking for the first time, asking what I had done. And all I said was, "I'm taking back what's mine." That was the moment he understood the house wasn't their victory. It was their downfall, and it had been in my hands the entire time. When the official notice reached them, I wasn't there to witness it, but I could picture the moment perfectly. His mother opening the door in her silk robe, expecting another delivery or a neighbor, only to be handed a sealed envelope with my name printed in bold on the top. I knew she'd tear it open with her sharp nails, eyes scanning words she could barely process. Eviction. Legal owner. 30 days. My husband must have walked in from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, only to see her face drain of color. He had always believed his mother's arrogance was enough to bend reality, but this time there was paper, law, and my signature standing in their way. While they scrambled, I sat quietly in my friend's apartment with my lawyer on speakerphone, methodically going over every detail. The deed, the mortgage, the payments, they were flawless, airtight. There wasn't a loophole for them to crawl through. I hadn't screamed when they kicked me out, and I wasn't going to scream now. Instead, I documented everything. Every text, every bank transfer, every purchase that proved my money built that house. In my mind, I replayed their smug laughter from that night, how he refused to even glance at me as I dragged my suitcase to the door. That memory no longer stung, it fueled me. I wanted them to realize that their power ended the second they underestimated me. And a few days later, when my husband finally called, his voice was nothing like the confident man who had turned his back on me. He stuttered, trying to bargain, saying things like, "Maybe we can work this out," or "We didn't mean for it to go this far." I let the silence hang until he grew desperate. Then I said calmly, "This isn't your house. It never was." I hung up before he could respond, because I had no intention of wasting another breath on a man who thought betrayal could be washed away with empty words. For the first time in years, I felt steady. The house wasn't just brick and walls anymore. It was proof. Proof that I had been right all along. Proof that their cruelty would fold in on itself. Proof that when you push someone too far, they stop playing by your rules and start making their own. The days that followed felt like slow revenge, written in real time. His mother started calling from numbers I didn't recognize, leaving voicemails dripping with fake sweetness. "Darling, let's talk this out. You don't want to break up a family over paperwork." I saved every single message, each one proof of her desperation. Then came the texts from him, longer this time, paragraphs about how stressed he was, how he only listened to her because she raised him alone after his father died, how I should understand that family comes first. Reading those words, I almost laughed. For years, I had been treated as nothing but their ATM. My income funneled into bills and renovations, while his mother played queen in the house she never lifted a finger to pay for. Now, suddenly, he wanted to play the role of peacemaker, but it was only because the walls were closing in. I kept my responses minimal, just forwarding everything to my lawyer and noting the dates. Meanwhile, social media was a battlefield. They stopped posting their cheerful photos. Friends who once liked every picture of their backyard barbecues now began messaging me privately, asking if it was true that I had owned the house all along. I didn't answer, but the shift was delicious, to watch from a distance. Reputation mattered more to his mother than air, and the whispers were already cutting off her oxygen. One evening, my lawyer called with an update. Not only did I own the property outright, but because they had forced me out without legal grounds, I could pursue damages. I sat in silence for a long time, the phone warm against my ear. This wasn't just about reclaiming walls and a roof anymore. This was about drawing a line so deep they could never cross it again. And as I looked out my friend's window at the city lights, I realized that for the first time, they weren't the ones dictating the next move. I was. The first face-to-face came sooner than I expected. I was stepping out of my lawyer's office, with a folder thick with documents when I saw her waiting by my car. My mother-in-law, dressed like she was attending Sunday service, pearls tied around her neck, lips painted in that harsh red she always wore when she wanted to look powerful. She didn't even let me unlock the door before she launched into her performance. "We're family," she said, her voice pitched high like she was scolding a child. "And families don't drag each other into court." I held the folder against my chest and simply stared at her. Years ago, that tone might have made me shrink, might have made me apologize for things that weren't my fault. But not now. I let her talk, about how embarrassed she was, about how the neighbors were asking questions, about how my husband hadn't been sleeping. Then she leaned closer and hissed, "If you loved him, you wouldn't do this." That was when I finally spoke. Calm. Even. "If he loved me, he wouldn't have stood there while you threw me out of my own house." Her face twitched, a crack, in the mask she wore so carefully. She reached out like she was going to grab my arm, but I stepped back, unlocking my car without breaking eye contact. "You have 30 days, I said, sliding into the driver's seat. "Use them wisely." I closed the door before she could answer, the glass between us muting her outrage into a muffled storm. As I pulled away, I caught her shrinking in, the rearview mirror, smaller than I had ever seen her. It struck me then that she wasn't untouchable anymore. She was just a woman who had overplayed her hand, and I was no longer afraid to call her bluff. It was my husband who showed up next 3 days later, right outside the cafe where I was meeting a colleague. I spotted him through the window before he saw me pacing on the sidewalk, running his hand through his hair the way he always did when he was cornered. For a moment, I thought he might keep walking, but then he spotted me, and the flicker of relief in his eyes made my stomach turn. He rushed in, pulling out the chair across from me like he had every right to sit there. My colleague, sensing the tension, excused herself quickly, leaving the two of us in a silence that carried years of resentment. He started talking fast, his words tumbling over each other, about how everything had gotten out of control, about how his mother didn't mean the things she said, about how we could fix this if I would just call off the eviction. His voice dropped lower then, almost pleading. We can't lose the house. Don't do this to me. I let him speak, my hands folded calmly on the table. For years I had carried the weight of his excuses, his family's chaos, their entitlement, dressed as tradition. And now here he was, asking me to undo what he himself had allowed. I told him the truth plainly. You already lost it. The moment you stood there and said nothing, you chose her over me. You chose comfort over loyalty. Don't come to me now because the walls are crumbling. He winced like I had struck him, but I didn't soften. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, saying he could change, that he would cut the cord with his mother, that we could start fresh. But the thing about starting fresh is it requires trust, and he had burned through every ounce of it. I looked at him steadily, not a shred of anger left, just clarity. This isn't about the house anymore. This is about me finally realizing, I don't need you. The words hit him harder than any lawsuit could. He sat back, stunned, as though he'd never considered that the woman who once bent over backwards to keep his world intact could also be the one to tear herself free. I stood up, slid a few bills onto the table for my coffee, and walked out without looking back. For the first time in years, I felt taller than him, lighter than him, freer than him, and I wasn't done yet. By the end of that week, the fallout had spilled into the neighborhood. I didn't even need to set foot on that street to know. The whispers traveled fast, and people who once smiled politely at his mother during her garden parties now turned their backs when she waved. A friend of mine who lived 2 blocks over sent me screenshots from the community Facebook group where questions were being asked in plain sight. Wait, wasn't that her daughter-in-law's house all along? How could she kick someone out if she didn't even own it? The comments piled up, and his mother, who thrived on appearances, began to suffocate under the scrutiny. I imagined her clutching her pearls tighter each time she read those words, imagined her pacing in the kitchen I had remodeled, staring at the chandelier I had chosen, realizing that everyone knew the truth, that she had strutted like a queen in a palace that had never been hers. My husband tried damage control in his own way. He began sending carefully crafted texts, the kind where he pretended he was reasonable, that he only wanted a fair resolution, as though the years of silence and complicity had never happened. When I didn't answer, he escalated to voicemails where his voice cracked under the pressure, a mixture of anger and desperation. He accused me of humiliating him, of ruining his reputation, of being vindictive. I didn't respond to those either. Each message was evidence, every word a reminder that I no longer had to carry the burden of his feelings. My lawyer and I began preparing not just to take back the house, but to push for compensation. He explained that because they had forcibly removed me without legal grounds, I could demand damages for emotional distress, temporary housing costs, even the personal belongings I had been forced to leave behind that night. As we drafted the paperwork, I remembered standing on that porch with my suitcase, shivering in the dark while they celebrated my absence inside. That image had burned in my mind for days, but now it fueled me. Every form I signed was a step toward justice. The irony wasn't lost on me. His mother had always boasted that their family was untouchable, that no one could embarrass them. Yet now, in the most public way possible, they were being stripped bare. The gossip didn't die down, it grew louder. Mutual friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, some offering sympathy, others quietly admitting they had seen this coming, that they had always noticed how I was treated like an outsider, despite being the one who held everything together. And with every word, every piece of support, I felt a strange strength hardening inside me. I didn't need revenge in the form of screaming matches or slammed doors. The real revenge was watching them unravel under the weight of their own arrogance. And the best part? I had only just begun to tighten the strings. The first court date was set for a Monday morning, and by then the entire charade they had built around themselves had begun to collapse in ways even I hadn't predicted. When I walked into the courthouse, documents neatly organized in the leather folder my lawyer had given me, I felt a steadiness in my chest that surprised me. For weeks, I had replayed the humiliation of that night, me dragging my suitcase across the hardwood floor while my husband stood there like a statue. But now, as I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, it was their turn to feel small. They shuffled in together, his mother clutching her oversized purse like it was a shield, my husband trailing behind her with his tie, crooked eyes darting nervously to the floor. For the first time, they didn't look like a powerful pair. They looked cornered. My lawyer laid out the facts methodically. The mortgage and deed in my name alone, the years of bank statements proving my income had covered every expense, the testimony of neighbors who had seen me removed from the house against my will. The evidence was undeniable. Every page another nail in the coffin of their performance. I didn't need to speak much, my documents did the talking. When the judge asked if I had anything to add, I simply said, I was forced out of my home. Without cause. I want my house back. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any long speech could have. His mother tried to argue, her voice rising, claiming that it had always been her son's family home, and that I was just bitter after the marriage soured. But every word unraveled under questioning. The judge asked her directly, "Whose name is on the deed?" she stammered. My husband, sitting beside her, shifted uncomfortably, sweat gathering at his temples. When pressed, he admitted he had never made a single payment. That moment, that one confession, was the turning point. You could feel the energy shift in the room, as though everyone, even the judge, realized exactly what had been happening. I had been used, exploited, and then discarded. But I wasn't discarded anymore. When the session ended, the ruling wasn't finalized yet, but the temporary order was clear. They had no legal standing to keep me out of the house, and they were to vacate immediately until the case closed. I sat still as the words were read, but inside I felt years of weight lift from my shoulders. My husband looked at me for the first time in weeks, his mouth opening like he wanted to plead, but nothing came out. His mother stormed past, her heels striking the floor too hard, her face a mask of rage she couldn't contain. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting, but the gossip mill might as well have been. By the time I reached my friend's apartment, messages were already pouring in from people who had heard pieces of the story. My silence became my shield. I didn't gloat. I didn't post online. I simply waited, knowing the worst for them was still coming. Because the case wasn't about just returning to the house, it was about showing the world, and myself, that I wasn't powerless. They had tried to strip me of dignity, of home, of safety, and now they were the ones exposed, their arrogance collapsing in public view. And as I sat quietly, sipping tea with my lawyer's words replaying in my head, I knew this was only the beginning of their downfall. 2 weeks later, the eviction order was executed, and I didn't have to lift a finger. The sheriff's deputies showed up early in the morning, their cars parked right in front of the house I had built with my money, and for the first time the roles were reversed. It was my husband and his mother being told to pack their belongings and leave. Neighbors gathered quietly along the sidewalk, pretending to check their mail or walk their dogs, but I knew why they were really there. They wanted to see the mighty family finally dragged down. His mother came out first, shouting at the officers, clutching boxes like she was being robbed, her pearls swinging loose around her neck. My husband trailed behind, dragging garbage bags full of clothes, his face pale and damp with sweat. I stayed back, across the street in my car with tinted windows, watching the spectacle unfold without a word. Every shout, every glare she threw at the deputies was a confirmation that I had done the right thing. They were being removed from what was never theirs, and they couldn't hide it anymore. By noon, the house was locked, the key back in my hands. I walked inside, the silence echoing around me. It didn't feel like home yet, but it felt like justice. Later that night, the first wave of humiliation hit them publicly. Photos had been taken, of course. Someone had snapped shots of them, hauling their boxes down the driveway, his mother screaming at the deputies, my husband with his head hanging low. Those photos spread fast online, shared in local groups and whispered about in circles that thrived on scandal. Suddenly, they weren't the polished family hosting barbecues and bragging about their social ties. They were the disgraced pair, tossed out of a house they had claimed as their own. The next day, he showed up at my friend's place. I didn't answer the door, but I could hear his voice through the intercom. breaking in ways I had never heard before. "Please," he said, "just let me explain. I made a mistake. We can start over. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me like this." I sat in silence, my hand hovering over the speaker button, but I didn't press it. I didn't need to. His desperation wasn't for me. It was for the life he had lost, the comfort his mother had built around him that crumbled the second I stopped funding it. And as he stood out there, begging, while I sat warm and safe inside, I realized this was the revenge I never even knew I wanted. Not yelling, not breaking down, but watching them fall apart under the weight of their own choices. They had kicked me out with nothing but a suitcase, and now they were the ones with their lives reduced to boxes and garbage bags. And that was only the beginning of what they stood to lose. After the eviction, the silence between us should have been final, but instead it grew louder. They had no roof, no audience, no control left, and so they began to reach for me in ways I never thought possible. It started with mutual friends. One evening, I got a call from an old colleague who sounded uncomfortable even before she said a word. "Listen," she began. "Your husband asked me to talk to you. He says he's sorry. He says he just wants to sit down with you privately. No lawyers." I thanked her for passing on the message, but I could hear the pity in her voice. She knew as well as I did that his regret wasn't about me. It was about the walls closing in. Days later, another acquaintance texted me out of the blue. "Your mother-in-law wanted me to tell you she's willing to apologize if you just give her some time to explain." I stared at the screen in disbelief. The same woman who had screamed at me to get out of her house was now trying to crawl back through third parties, too proud to face me directly but too desperate to stay silent. Their pride and their survival were at war, and survival was losing. Then came the letters. Handwritten notes slid under my lawyer's office door, delivered to my workplace, left in my mailbox. Pages filled with shaky handwriting where my husband begged me to remember our good years, where his mother promised that family always finds a way back together. I read them once, carefully, then tucked them into the growing file of evidence. Each letter was proof not of reconciliation but of collapse, proof that they were unraveling without the house, without control, without me. The breaking point came when they tried to show up at a mutual friend's dinner. I had gone reluctantly, needing a taste of normal life, laughter over wine, a night where I didn't have to think about lawyers and courtrooms. And then, halfway through, the door opened, and in they walked. My husband's eyes darted immediately to mine, and in that moment, surrounded by people, he fell to pieces. He crossed the room too quickly, his words spilling out. "Please, just hear me out. We're ruined without you. I can't." His mother tried to drag him back, whispering furiously under her breath, but he pulled away from her. The entire table went silent, forks suspended midair, eyes flicking between us. I stood, steady, not a tremor in my hands. And I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This conversation belongs in court, not here." Then I turned my back to him and walked away, the sound of my heels clicking against the floor sharper than his mother's hiss of rage behind me. That was the night I understood something new. They weren't just losing their house. They were losing their standing, their reputation, the mask they had worn for decades. And every time they tried to beg or bargain through friends, through letters, through public humiliations, it only stripped them further of the power they once used to crush me. I didn't need to retaliate with words. I didn't need to gloat. Their downfall was writing itself in real time, and all I had to do was let it play out. When the official letters began arriving from their lawyer, I knew they had finally run, out of pride, and were trying to mask their desperation with legal ink. The envelopes came neatly stamped, heavy with formality, but I could see through every carefully chosen phrase. They were begging. They wanted a settlement, a soft landing, anything that would allow them to step away without the crushing weight of damages or the stain of a permanent ruling. Their lawyer wrote about family unity, about misunderstandings that had escalated too far, about how prolonging the case would harm everyone involved. But behind the polished language was a plea. "Please stop before we lose everything." I didn't answer. My lawyer told me to stay silent, let the process play out, and I listened, because silence had become my sharpest weapon. Every day they spent waiting, not knowing my next move, was a day their fear grew larger than their arrogance. When we returned to court, the shift was visible on their faces. My husband looked older, his tie crooked, sweat collecting at his temples, his hands unable to stay still. He had always been a man who relied on my steadiness to ground him, but now, stripped of it, he was unraveling in front of everyone. His mother, usually the picture of rigid control, sat stiff as a statue, her jaw tight, her eyes darting toward the gallery filled with neighbors and acquaintances who had come not for justice but for spectacle. The whispers that once fed her ego now cut her down in public. The judge asked directly if there was any chance of reconciliation, and my husband's voice cracked as he tried to say he wanted one. But when it was my turn to speak, my words were clear and steady. Reconciliation ended the night they forced me out of my own house with nothing but a suitcase. There is nothing left to repair. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. His mother's mask broke for just a second, her lips tightening as though she had bitten down on her own tongue, and the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew the truth. This wasn't just a marriage gone sour. This was betrayal written in stone. The judge ruled quickly after that. Not only was the house mine, as the documents had proven all along, but the wrongful eviction entitled me to compensation, legal fees, damages, and costs for the months I was forced into temporary housing. It wasn't just about giving me back what was mine. It was about making them pay for what they had done. The gavel struck, and with that sound, years of manipulation and cruelty shattered. My husband sat slumped, staring at the table as if he could disappear into it, while his mother hissed furiously at their attorney, demanding to know how this had happened, as if her rage alone could reverse the law. But there was nothing left for them to twist, no narrative left to rewrite. The truth was written in black and white on official paper, and for the first time, it was undeniable. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Cool, clean, sharper than I remembered. I walked past them without a glance, the folder of documents, pressed against my chest, and climbed into my car. They stood on the steps behind me, smaller than I had ever seen them, their silhouettes no longer intimidating but pathetic against the grand stone walls of justice. By the time I pulled away, I knew the damage wasn't just legal or financial. It was reputational, social, personal. They had built their lives on control, on appearances, on silencing me. And now the silence was theirs to endure, the kind that came when every door slowly closed, when every whisper turned against them, when every mask slipped and no one believed the performance anymore. From that moment forward, I didn't need to lift a finger. Their downfall had already begun, and the more they clawed to stop it, the faster they fell. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like their victim. I felt like the architect of my own survival. After the ruling, their lives began to unravel in ways that even I hadn't anticipated, and it didn't take long for the consequences to show. Within a week, their lawyer filed a notice that the damages had to be paid in installments because they simply didn't have the money. My lawyer smirked when he told me this because it meant everything they had flaunted for years was smoke and mirrors, their so-called wealth nothing more than appearances and borrowed status. His mother, who once prided herself on her carefully curated reputation, was suddenly reduced to whispers in grocery store aisles and muttered gossip at church. People who used to admire her garden parties now avoided eye contact, too eager to distance themselves from her humiliation. My husband fared no better. Without the house, without me, without anyone willing to cover for him, he began showing up at friends' couches with duffel bags, overstaying his welcome until one by one they stopped answering his calls. He even tried showing up at my workplace, waiting in the parking lot until security escorted him off the property. Each time I kept my distance, never yelling, never engaging, because his desperation spoke louder than anything I could say. The first payment from them arrived as a certified check, and holding it in my hands felt surreal, not because of the money itself, but because it was proof that the tables had completely turned. The same people who had thrown me out like I was disposable were now legally required to fund the life I was rebuilding without them. I deposited it calmly, went home to the house they once stole from me, and lit a candle in the kitchen where his mother had screamed that it would never be mine. The flame flickered against the walls, and for the first time that space felt cleansed. reclaimed, no longer tainted by their voices. But the humiliation wasn't just private anymore. By the time the case was fully settled and the compensation order began draining their accounts month after month, the cracks in their world had widened into canyons. His mother, once the self-appointed queen of neighborhood gatherings, found herself uninvited to every social circle she had clung to. The women who used to sip wine on her porch now whispered behind her back about how foolish she had been, about how she had spent years living in a house that was never hers, flaunting a status built on lies. She tried to hold on, dressing up, forcing smiles at church. But people looked past her, and the emptiness of that silence was something she couldn't disguise. Her empire of appearances collapsed without ceremony, leaving her isolated in a small, dark apartment where no one came to call. My husband, stripped of both comfort and respect, spiraled faster. Without me to anchor him, without her to shield him, he drifted from couch to couch, overstaying his welcome until friends stopped answering the door. He tried to keep his job, but the shame followed him into the office, colleagues whispering about the lawsuit, about the eviction photos that had circled online. Eventually, he stopped showing up, claiming stress, but the truth was, he couldn't face anyone anymore. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he spent nights drinking, calling people he hadn't spoken to in years, trying to patch together sympathy from anyone who would listen. But sympathy dried up quickly when people realized his downfall wasn't bad luck. It was his own choices catching up with him. Their desperation turned official when the letters from their lawyer shifted tone entirely. Gone were the arguments about family and misunderstanding. Now the pages carried words like settlement request, forgiveness, compassion. They begged for reduced payments, begged for leniency, begged me to consider the long history of family ties. It was a performance dressed in legal ink, but I could see the cracks in every line. They weren't protecting their dignity anymore. They were clinging to survival. My lawyer asked if I wanted to respond, but I didn't. Silence had become my signature, and each unanswered plea was louder than anything I could write. Then came the moment that sealed it. An envelope, heavier than the rest, delivered by courier with trembling hands. Inside were 2 letters, one from him, one from his mother. His was rambling, ink smudged in places where the pen had pressed too hard, begging me to remember who he used to be, asking me not to let this be the end. Hers was shorter, stiff, full of pride that couldn't quite mask the cracks. She admitted she had gone too far, that she shouldn't have spoken the way she did, but her apology was wrapped in self-preservation, not remorse. Both letters smelled of defeat, of people who had finally understood that there was no way back. I read them once, tucked them into the file with all the others, and closed the folder with a finality that echoed in my chest. Because by then, their downfall was complete. They weren't just stripped of the house or the money. They were stripped of the narrative they had tried to write, the one where I was disposable and they were untouchable. And as I sat alone in the home I had reclaimed, light spilling through freshly painted walls, I realized I no longer needed anything from them. Not their apologies, not their suffering, not even their acknowledgement. Their collapse was theirs to live with, and my freedom was mine to keep. By the time the dust settled and the court orders turned into monthly checks that steadily drained their accounts, my life had already begun to bloom in ways I hadn't thought possible when I stood on that porch months earlier with only a suitcase in my hand. The house, once poisoned by their voices, was transformed room by room until it no longer carried the echo of that night. I replaced the heavy curtains his mother had insisted on with sheer fabric that let in the sun. I tore out the stiff rugs she had laid down to impress guests. I painted the walls in colors I chose for myself, and with every brushstroke the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a sanctuary. People who had once pitied me now stopped me in grocery aisles and told me I had inspired them, that standing my ground had reminded them they didn't have to let others trample their worth. My silence had become its own kind of strength, and in that quiet I built something no scream from them could ever reach. Meanwhile, their decline became impossible to ignore. His mother, once the queen of social gatherings, now lived alone in a cramped rental on the edge of town, curtains always drawn, phone lines always quiet. The women she had courted for years no longer returned her calls, and the whispers that followed her into the market were harsher than anything she had ever thrown at me. My husband, stripped of pride, job, and friends, was seen wandering between bars, his clothes unkempt, his eyes hollow, still telling anyone who would listen that I had ruined his life. But people didn't believe him anymore. The photos of the eviction, the stories that had circulated through every corner of our community, the truth revealed in court, they all painted a picture too clear to deny. He wasn't a victim. He was the author of his own downfall. One evening, I came home to find a small package on my doorstep. Inside was my wedding ring, left without a note. For a moment, I stared at it, the gold band glinting under the hallway. Light, and I thought about the years I had worn it, the promises attached to it, the weight of believing we were partners. Then I closed the box and set it in a drawer I rarely opened. It didn't hurt, it didn't sting, it felt like the last. Thread finally cut, the final symbol of a life I no longer belonged to. In the end, I didn't need to confront them again. I didn't need to stand over their ruin and demand acknowledgement. Their ruin was public, visible to everyone, undeniable even to themselves. My revenge was never in shouting or in spectacle. It was in reclaiming everything they thought they could take from me and living a life untouched by their poison. And as I sat one night on the porch of my house, the house I had built and paid for, the house they had tried to steal, I realized the real victory wasn't in their destruction. It was in my survival, my strength, and the quiet peace they could never reach. And now I can finally say it without trembling. They kicked me out of the house I paid for, but I took it back, and in losing me, they lost everything. When I think back to the night they shoved me out of the house with only a suitcase in my hand, I almost don't recognize the woman I was then. She was smaller, quieter, holding on to the illusion that loyalty and sacrifice would earn her respect. She stood on the porch shivering, waiting for her husband to look at her, to stop his mother, to protect her, and when he didn't, she thought, it meant she had nothing left. But now, from where I sit, I see that night for what it really was. It was the breaking point that set me free. They thought by slamming that door in my face they had won, that I would fade into the shadows while they lived comfortably off everything I had worked for. What they didn't know was that in that same moment they wrote the first line of their downfall, and I was the one who would hold the pen until the end. The courts confirmed what I had always known, that the house was mine, that the money came from me, that the so-called family who cast me aside had no power without my name holding them up. Watching them shrink in the courtroom as the judge read the ruling will stay with me forever. Not because I enjoyed their humiliation, but because it was the first time they were forced to face reality. The mask they wore for years cracked in, public, and the truth spilled out for everyone to see. My husband, who once stood by silently as I was thrown out, now sat silent for a different reason, because there was nothing left he could say. His mother, who once screamed that I didn't belong, now stared down at her hands because the house she had boasted about was never hers to begin with. And as their lives crumbled, mine began again. I reclaimed the house piece by piece, turning every room into a space that reflected me, not them. The heavy curtains she had chosen to impress guests were replaced with light that poured in through open windows. The sterile, staged furniture they insisted on for appearances gave way to comfort I chose for myself. With every change, every stroke of paint, every plant I placed by the window, I stripped their presence from the walls until I could finally breathe again. This time the house wasn't just mine legally. It was mine emotionally, spiritually, piece by piece rebuilt into a sanctuary instead of a prison. Meanwhile, their fall only deepened. His mother, who had once strutted down aisles at the grocery store with her head high, now kept her eyes on the floor, muttering under her breath as neighbors whispered behind her. She had lost her kingdom of appearances, and no amount of pearls or forced smiles could bring it back. My husband, left adrift, wandered between couches and bars, his pleas growing weaker with every unanswered call. They had built their entire lives on the illusion of power, but the moment I stopped feeding that illusion, it collapsed like sand through their fingers. Their apologies, if they can even be called that, were never about love or family. They were about survival. And I refused to carry their survival on my back any longer. The sweetest part of this revenge wasn't the court ruling or the compensation. It wasn't the eviction or the gossip that followed them everywhere. The sweetest part was sitting alone on the porch one evening, the sun setting over the garden. I had replanted, hearing nothing but silence. No shouting, no accusations, no manipulation, just peace.